As recently as June of 2023, a certified authentic letter from Princess Diana to Jimmy Savile was sold off on a legitimate auctioning website. As far as I can tell, this letter had no online footprint until this recent auction, and the contents of the letter are pretty wild. I can't believe I haven't seen any coverage of this letter yet, and it has some insane implications that I've built a case around. I'm Jamie Crawford, and welcome to the Panopticon. So before I get to the letter, I'm going to present the story in the order that I pieced it together. So on November 14th, 1995, Princess Diana attended an opening ceremony for a new ward at Broadmoor Mental Hospital. Just 30 minutes into her 4-hour visit, news broke that she had given her now infamous panorama interview to Martin Bashir, and that would be airing 6 days later on November 20th. So while Diana was conducting her visit at the hospital, the BBC was explaining that when she agreed to be interviewed, she placed no constraints on the subject matter or the duration of the interview. The interview was to cover every stage of her life as the Princess of Wales, including her family, her separation, and her future plans. The Queen was reportedly furious, and Charles was reportedly left reeling with shock and anger. A spokesman for the BBC confirmed that Diana directed the specific timing of this announcement. The princess asked that we didn't inform anybody at all until she had spoken to the palace, which she was only able to do this morning. One BBC source stated that the corporation was anxious to keep the interview a secret, yet Diana insisted and got her wish. So why did Diana deliberately time this news of her tell-all interview to break while she was visiting Broadmoor Hospital of all places? Back in 1995, this wouldn't raise any eyebrows amongst the public. But modern context now grants us the knowledge that Broadmoor is one of the hospitals where Jimmy Savile was given a position of power and a full set of keys, which he used to access and abuse countless patients. The hacking group Anonymous has speculated in the past that Diana could have known about Savile's crimes due to all of their overlapping work at hospitals all across the country. Imagine you were a disenfranchised mental patient, getting consistently abused by this famous, powerful, beloved national figure who is just a monster behind the scenes.
That is supposed to be me, that's. What did I ever do to you that you would draw that picture of me?
Everything.
Super times for all. No danger about it. In fact, let me tell you, if you don't work in a hospital, you really are missing something. In fact, you're missing everything.
How hopeless would you feel? But then miraculously, Princess Diana, who has been deified as the people's princess, comes waltzing into your room. She's maybe the one person you would think could and would help you.
Then I found myself being more and more involved with people who were rejected by society. I'd say drug addicts, alcoholism, battered this, battered that. And I found an affinity there. And I respected very much the honesty I found on that level with people I met. Because in hospices, for instance, when people are dying, they're much more open and more vulnerable. And much more real than other people, and I appreciated that.
And Jimmy Savile and Princess Diana were no strangers to one another. Savile was a mentor to Prince Charles, and he bizarrely acted as a marriage counselor for the royal couple, despite his total lack of credentials. Savile was intimately and intrusively and inappropriately involved in Princess Diana's life and marriage.
Astonishingly, Savile began to involve himself in the royal couple's personal affairs.
He inserted himself into their marriage in the way that he was someone who made himself available. And Charles liked having him around.
Well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded.
He would turn up, Diana told me, at Kensington Palace, where she lived, uninvited, and would manage to persuade the police on the gate, who never let anyone in without an invitation, to walk in.
People's agendas changed overnight. I was now separated, wife to Prince of Wales. I was a problem. I was a liability, seen as. And how are we going to deal with her? This hasn't happened before.
Who was asking those questions?
People around me, people in this environment, and...
The royal household?
people in my environment, yes, yeah.
They began to see you as a problem.
Yes, very much so.
She said he would sort of come and say, well, I'm just here just to check up on you. And she said that Charles used to sort of quip. If there was a problem that needed sorting out, they get Jimmy to do it because Jim will fix it. I think she found it slightly unnerving.
Mm-hmm.
How did that show itself?
By visits abroad being blocked, by things that had come naturally in my way being stopped, letters going, got lost, and various things.
So despite the fact that your interest was always to continue with your duties, you found that your duties were being held from you?
Yes. Everything changed after we separated, and life became very difficult then for me.
Who was behind that change?
Well, my husband's side were very busy stopping me.
Once again, those with suspicions felt powerless to challenge him.
I always had my doubts about him. I just didn't like the man. I thought he was ghastly. He would go into the office in the summer in particular, where you've got secretaries there who are doing correspondence. They're wearing a sleeveless dress, and he would take their hand and kiss their hand and run his lips right up their arms, which is pretty unsavory.
This was something that he even carried out on Princess Diana. He licked Princess Diana's hand and she recoiled from that. As she told me, it was something very creepy.
So with all of that in mind, it just stuck out to me that Princess Diana specifically chose to time this announcement of her tell-all interview to release right when she's visiting Broadmoor Hospital. Now, I actually noted all of this a couple years ago now, but I recently decided to revisit this topic, and I found this incredibly fascinating document. So like I said, as recently as June of 2023, this certified authentic letter from Princess Diana to Jimmy Savile was sold off on this legitimate auctioning website. Before this auction, this letter had seemingly no online footprint, and it hasn't been covered by any traditional or new media. So first, let me just read the letter in its entirety. Dear Jimmy, I'm sorry to have been out of touch for so long, but I know you've been busy, and I fear you may have just noticed that I am still alive too. I particularly wanted you to know that I have continued my interest in mental illness, and especially the work of the special hospitals. I am due to return to Broadmoor, temporarily, on 14th of November for a public engagement, but more importantly, to stay for a private tour of certain departments after the official business is over. I'm very keen to do more than just pass through as an occasional visitor, not least because I feel Alan Frainy deserves maximum support in the face of a media interest which is too often negative, to put it mildly. In discussion with Alan, I hope to identify ways in which I might help foster public understanding of Broadmoor's role. No firm details yet, but I just wanted Sir J, who has done so much more for Broadmoor than I ever could, to hear about it from me. With love, from Diana. So there was a lot that jumped out to me about that letter, but let's start off by just noting that it was written on October 10th, 1995, which was the same day that Diana's upcoming trip to Broadmoor hit the newspapers. This makes sense, as the hospital visit was the subject of her letter to Savile. I just wanted Sir J to hear about it from me. Now, Diana makes two identifiable jokes in this brief letter. In regard to the fact that they have been out of touch for so long, she quips, I fear you may have just noticed that I am still alive too. Then she goes on to say I am due to return to Broadmoor, and adds the word temporarily in jest to clarify that she does not need to be checked into the mental hospital as a patient. Now this is where it gets really interesting, because this letter was written in October of 1995. And according to the Operation Padet inquiry report, conducted by the Metropolitan Police, October of 1995 is the same month that she met with her lawyer, Lord Mishcon, who then documented that the Princess of Wales had told him that reliable sources, whom she did not wish to name, had informed her that by April of 1996, whether in an accident in her car, such as a pre-prepared brake failure, or by other means, efforts would be made, if not to get rid of her, then at least to see that she was so injured or damaged as to be declared unbalanced. The Paget report also documented that Diana had told Simone Simmons and Hasnat Khan that she had experienced brake failure, and she believed it was due to tampering. Simmons stated that one day in 1995, and she could not be more specific after this length of time, the Princess of Wales telephoned her from her car, saying that the brakes had failed and that she thought that they had been tampered with. The Princess of Wales subsequently wrote a note to Simone Simmons, stating that MI5 or MI6 were involved. Simone Simmons believed the note read something like, "Dear Simone, as you know, the brakes of my car have been tampered with. If something does happen to me, it will be MI5 or MI6 who will have done it. Lots of love, Diana." In 1995, Hasnat Khan saw her driving a particular motor vehicle. When he saw her in a car a couple months later, which he described as around December of 1995, she was in a different car, a BMW. Hasnat Khan asked her what had happened to the previous car, as it was such a lovely vehicle. The Princess of Wales told him the brakes had been tampered with, so she had decided to change the car. Diana also wrote a note to her butler, Paul Burrell, and he originally thought that the letter was written in October of 1996, but the Padet report deemed that October of 1995 was more likely, and he agreed that that was possible. "This particular phase in my life is the most dangerous. My husband is planning an accident in my car, brake failure and serious head injury in order to make the path clear for Charles to marry." The Paget report concluded that October of 1995 was the probable time that she believed her brakes had been tampered with in order to kill her or cause serious brain injury, which notably aligns with her October 10th letter to Jimmy Savile, where she expressed that he might have just noticed that she is still alive and that she doesn't need to be admitted to Broadmoor Hospital as a mental patient. And just to briefly return to Hasnat Khan's statement that Diana told him that she switched to the BMW specifically because of the brake tampering, well, through my own research on the extensive archives on newspapers.com, I found that the first documented sighting of Diana in the BMW was on October 30th, the same day as her meeting with her lawyer, Lord Mishcon. The last documented sighting of Diana in her signature Audi was on September 29th, just 11 days before her letter to Savile. I'm pretty convinced by these findings that Diana thought that Savile had something to do with the brake failure she experienced in October of 1995. And if she thought Savile was this insidious of a person that was capable of that, then it really adds new context to the rest of the letter that, on its surface, is so friendly and fawning. She takes what could be perceived as a shot at Savile's own sick predilections. "I particularly wanted you to know that I have continued my interest in mental illness." She seems to mark her territory and emphasizes that she has a vested interest in this hospital that served as Savile's hunting ground. "I'm very keen to do more than just pass through as an occasional visitor." She also evokes the concept of a media interest, which is too often negative, and her hopes to help foster public understanding of Broadmoor's role. Alan Frainy is the only other person Diana mentions in the letter. Frainy was a key figure in the eventual report on Savile's actions at Broadmoor. Frainy was installed at Broadmoor Hospital upon Savile's request, despite the fact that he was widely agreed upon as unqualified for the position. Savile knew him from Leeds General Infirmary, another hospital he preyed upon, and from running charity races together. During this time period, he had been described as Savile's public relations man. Throughout the Broadmoor report, there are many troubling details about Frainy. He reportedly ignored complaints of Savile's sexual assaults. He reportedly said that Savile had a little secret, a liking for young girls, the younger the better. He reportedly had his own inappropriate relationships with female staff members at his hospital accommodation. And it was concluded that it is impossible to examine Savile's position in the hospital and his ability to exploit it without understanding Frainy's role in the management of the hospital. The BBC produced this sycophantic documentary on Savile in 2011, after he died but before the truth all came flooding out. And Alan Frainy appeared in this documentary a few times with some interesting words.
You finished the marathon in London with Jimmy, and a quarter of an hour later you're having tea at Buckingham Palace, because that's where we used to go. But it wasn't a case of getting changed. You went in your shorts, your t-shirt with your medal around your neck, still sweating, and you just went in for tea in Buckingham Palace. There's not many people that do that. He gave back, and I think he got pleasure from giving back. You know, I've often heard people say that no one really knew the real Jimmy. That's not true. Jimmy allowed people he wanted to get to know him to get to know him.
At Broadmoor, he had accommodation, keys and access to vulnerable patients. His influence was enormous. His friend Alan Frainy was given a job as a general manager despite, the report says, his relative inexperience. This was all he had to say today.
I am very sorry for the victims, absolutely, of course I am, across the whole of the NHS, but I have nothing else to say at the moment, I'm sorry. Okay.
This Broadmoor report also mentioned Princess Diana, who visited the hospital on several occasions. 2 were official visits, and several were less formal visits, arranged at a shorter notice, when the princess would spend time talking to patients, sometimes in private conversations. The first official visit was on March 7th, 1991, and of course the second was on November 14th, 1995. But just a year earlier, on November 3rd, 1994, Diana showed up for an informal visit. She apparently pleaded with officials to be let in, and spent an hour at Burnley Ward, an intensive care ward for highly disturbed female patients. Unsurprisingly, Burnley Ward would go on to be mentioned specifically in the Broadmoor report. In the Burnley Ward, Savile put his hand on one victim's leg, and then, while still talking, proceeded to move it upwards and grope her genitalia. Savile did not use restraint. She told a member of staff, who said she must have imagined it. Savile would assault her in the same way on several occasions over a period of weeks, before moving on to some other patient. His approach to the other patients he assaulted, who she said tended to be the younger and more vulnerable women, was the same. She also described assaults on her and other patients, both physically and sexual, by male staff. One staff member who made a routine visit to Burnley Ward in 1990 or 1991 glanced into the day room. He was taken aback to see Savile sitting on a bench between 2 female patients. The room was otherwise unoccupied, but one staff member was standing outside the day room doorway, as if keeping watch. Both patients, Savile, and the staff member jumped guiltily, as if surprised, and Savile challenged our interviewee, asking him what he was doing there. So based off of all of this information, I think there are some pressing questions that are really warranted. Did Diana suspect that Jimmy Savile had something to do with her brake failure in 1995? I personally am convinced that the answer is yes. Savile had a reputation as a fixer, and according to Savile, this reputation actually preceded and motivated the Jim'll Fix It series in the first place. I was working on Top of the Pops and they were desperate for me to do a series. One of the BBC men says, "Listen Jimmy, you've been fixing it for people all your life. Why don't we do a program where we fix it for people on film?" According to the Broadmoor report, senior civil servant Cliff Graham valued Savile as someone who could cut to the chase and simplify problems. Alan Frainy referred to him as the Godfather. Savile would also refer to himself as this nickname in a 1983 interview with The Sun. "The people who work for me call me the Godfather, and nobody messes with the Godfather. He is the boss, the big man. I know how to take care of myself, and I know how to take care of anyone who gets a bit cocky, a bit above himself. Some of the hairy things I've done would get me 10 years inside. I never get physical personally. Let's just say that while I'm in Edinburgh, very dodgy things happen in London. I'm quite innocent, I'm out of the way." Did Diana see herself as a complex problem that Jim will simply fix? To say nothing of her eventual death 2 years later in 1997. To say nothing over whether her brake failure was actually due to tampering. If she merely suspected that Jimmy Savile was involved in that, then that is an immensely fascinating detail on its own. If it is granted that the 2 jabs Diana makes in the letter are antagonistic, then it requires the rest of the friendly cordial letter to be reevaluated with that context. She emphasizes that she has a vested interest in the hospital and isn't just a passerby. She evokes the concept of negative media attention and talks about fostering public understanding regarding Broadmoor. Did she know the evil Savile was inflicting there? The deliberate timing of her actions to coincide with the news stories that she knows are hitting the headlines implies a premeditated calculation. On October 10th, it hit newspapers that she would be visiting Broadmoor, and she wrote to Savile that day. Then when she visited Broadmoor on November 14th, news broke of her upcoming tell-all interview, and we know for a fact that she controlled the timing of this announcement. Was this her way of threatening to expose Savile?
And I'm a great believer that you should always confuse the enemy.
Who was the enemy?
Well, the enemy was my husband's department.
She famously was very media savvy, and she knew that she could use the press to send a clear message with only her presence and not a single word. The memorable image of Diana sitting alone in front of the Taj Mahal, the tomb built by a Mughal emperor for his wife, was the most vivid example of how she got her message out through photographs. On a visit many years earlier, Charles had vowed to bring his future wife to the romantic monument. palace officials planning the schedule for the India trip in February 1992 had no knowledge of the prince's pledge and didn't give a second thought to Diana's sole visit. It was only the day before, when they saw the pack's excitement, that they realized the photographers wanted a picture to fit the story they planned. Diana understood too, and obligingly posed. Her message? The marriage was indeed on the rocks.
It was very much a poker game, chess game.
And of course we have to talk about the interview itself, because obviously she didn't actually expose Jimmy Savile. But if Diana did obtain this knowledge of Savile's crimes and was indeed flexing that knowledge, then that comes along with its own troubling implication. She obviously didn't bring any direct attention to Savile's crimes, either during the tell-all interview or any time afterwards. Did she just cynically want to keep this compromising information as an arrow in her quiver? To divulge this information would hopefully put an end to Savile's crimes, but then she would no longer have this information to leverage. It also ran the risk of damaging or destroying the royal institution itself, which she admitted in the interview she had no intention of doing.
I've heard people say to me that, Diana's out to destroy the monarchy, which has bewildered me, because why would I want to destroy something that is my children's future? I will fight for my children on any level in order for them to be happy and have peace of mind and carry out their duties.
If Diana did indeed know about Savile's sick predilections, then it makes it a lot less convincing for the rest of the royal family to claim that they had no idea, which is what they've always maintained since the Savile revelations. Diana would have had the motivation to keep this information out of the public eye, to protect the institution that she admitted would define her children's futures. But that's not to say she condoned Savile's actions, but she could have wanted to put an end to the abuse in a way that avoided public scrutiny. In her letter to Savile, she emphasizes her vested interest in the hospital, which would imply that she at least wants to take a stand against the abuse in a more private fashion. If she knew about Savile, would she not voice her qualms with the Queen and Prince Charles directly, privately, before ever going nuclear and taking this information public? It's also worth pointing out that she told Simone Simmons that if she dies in a car accident, then it will be MI5 and MI6 who have done it. And it really looks like she thought Savile was involved in her brake failure. So did Diana suspect that Savile was in some way associated with British intelligence? She wouldn't be the first person to wonder about that. The way he rose to the top of so many of Britain's most powerful institutions. From the BBC to Buckingham Palace to Downing Street. He became a household name as the host of BBC programmes in an era where MI5 were actively vetting BBC staff. He was able to waltz into Kensington Palace without invitation. He would spend Christmas with Margaret Thatcher. All while the BBC and UK police were ignoring allegations and running cover for decades. Charles reportedly sent Savile a box of cigars and a pair of gold cufflinks on his 80th birthday, with a note that read, "Nobody will ever know what you have done for this country, Jimmy. This is to go some way in thanking you for that." Whether Savile was directly connected to intelligence is a subject I want to continue to pursue and potentially find evidence for, but it seems like at least Diana thought he was. I don't think I'm done with this story. I think there's a lot more information out there to gather, and hopefully just releasing what I have so far will help catalyze more details to come into place. So please like and share this video and subscribe to see where it goes from here. I've also published these findings in an article on my new Substack, so please go support me over there as well and give my article a read if you want to comprehend the story further. And I'm putting all of my findings out on the internet for free because I think it's important. But I'm trying to make a career out of this, so if you think this information is valuable, then please consider leaving a tip using the links below. And if you can't spare the change, then yeah, just please help circulate this information. Feel free to email me at the address below with any story, tips, or inquiries. And yeah, thanks for watching.
You can put almost any frail object in a box, and provided it's held firm, you can shake it about no end. But if it's loose in a box, that's another matter. A car is a box on wheels, but a box just the same. And it can still get shaken about. And if you're in it and not wearing a seatbelt, you're in trouble because you're a loose object. It doesn't matter who you are or what you are, you can be the world's most experienced driver, but to the law of gravity, you're the world's most experienced loose object. And it can be very unfunny.
Now, an egg hasn't got much in the way of brains, but you have. Wear a seatbelt.
Clunk, click, every trip.